Welcome to Build a Business Worth Buying, the podcast where seasoned entrepreneurs, M&A experts, and world-class operators share behind-the-scenes stories of building, scaling, and selling remarkable businesses. I'm your host, Aaron Alpeter, and every week I sit down with people shaping the world of acquisitions, founders who've cashed out, buyers with bold strategies, and advisors who help make deals happen. This is not a podcast for beginners. It's for those who know the grind and want actionable insights to make their next big move. Get ready to take notes, rethink your strategy, and hear untold stories of what it takes to build a business worth buying. Hey everybody, welcome back to Build a Business Worth Buying. I'm really excited for this episode. Today we've got Tim Hoskins with Quester with us. And kind of the key question of why I wanted Tim on was around innovation. And I kind of have this question on my mind of where do good ideas come from? Are they strokes of genius? Is it the result of hard science or something in between? And Tim has really built his career on helping companies develop and think through what innovation means to them. He's the author of Insights on the Brink, which is a fresh take on market research and analytics. And he spent the last 10 years as president of Quester, a market research firm specializing in innovation. Tim brings a unique perspective to the podcast and really what works and what doesn't work in innovation. So Tim, thank you for being on. I'm so excited to have you.
Absolutely. I appreciate it. Innovation is something that I get to talk about at least 50% of my day. Sometimes I wish it was 100%. It's a passion of mine, and we're very, very lucky as an organization, helping some of the world's biggest companies build their innovation pipelines, anywhere from incremental fast innovations to something that is 3 to 5 years out. Some of the initiatives we're talking about most recently are more foresight related, where we're looking 7 to 10 years out, not necessarily identifying products, but more territories and opportunities where things are going to collide or intersect. So it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, that sounds interesting. I want to kind of get into really the core of what Quester does. And my understanding is that you guys help big companies innovate. And what are some of the common challenges that large organizations face when trying to innovate?
One of the challenges is large organizations have so much information. They have so many, incredibly successful and sophisticated people, but they also have a long history. And so there's a couple of different biases, I would say, that can sneak into the innovation process. And recognizing these biases and making sure that they don't sneak in is what separates, in my opinion, a large organization that does innovation the right way and is successful at it, and those who don't. So let's talk about the first one, and that is historical bias. Historical bias is when you've tried something once, maybe 5, 7 years ago, 10 years ago, and it didn't work. And so you completely dismiss that territory, that need for the consumer, or that idea altogether. How many innovations, Aaron, in our lifetime have just come too early?
I would say most of them.
Most of them. Most innovations have just come too early. And so the other challenge is, depending upon what industry you're in, let's say you're in consumer packaged goods. You don't have, or you historically didn't have, the luxury of going direct to consumer. And so a success of an innovation or a failure of an innovation was actually dictated by the retailers, not the actual company themselves. Okay? So if you convince that retailer to get shelf space and that product isn't moving fast enough, you could be meeting the needs of consumers, and it could be the best innovation for them. But the velocity wasn't there, so the retailer deemed it a failure. So historical and contextual bias is the first thing I think is really, really important. The other one is people bias. Again, great ideas exist inside of the walls of an organization. The great ideas, along with extremely talented and sophisticated people. But when you're talking about incremental ideas, I think that corporations are well suited to do incremental ideas within the 4 walls with a little bit of outside help. But when you're talking about breakthrough ideas that will transform category boundaries, ideas that may even change the shape and feel and look in the heart of an organization, now it's where do you let those people biases, right? Acknowledge them, but don't let them get in the way of progress and process.
That's interesting. Yeah, I think experience can be a great benefit, but I think there's a reason why so many founders are just out of school, right? It's just
Absolutely.
they don't have those battle scars, and so there is, I don't know if naivete is the right word, but they don't have that baggage that you're talking about. It
Yeah.
makes a lot of sense.
And I think that there is a third one, and I'll kind of quote the a book called Founder's Mentality, which has been a pivotal piece of writing for me as a leader, as well as our innovation and our brand strategy practices. It talks about an insurgent mission, right? And when we look at startups, they've recognized a very, very specific, sometimes niche need for consumers. They understand it deeply because typically those founders experience that in their prior lives. That's why they started a company and built a solution to, solve for it. Now, I'm not talking about every founder and every, you
Yeah.
know, company, but the mass majority of them, it's from a past experience. They deeply understand that because they've lived it. Now they're developing a solution or a product to solve for it.
It's
Right?
interesting because kind of what you're saying is that experience is important, and that experience leads you to that innovation, but it can also be something that blocks you from the innovation. And
Yeah.
so I'm wondering, are there any frameworks or methodologies that you find are helpful in creating this idea around innovation? How do you keep it from becoming bureaucratic?
Yes. And so for us, and again, we work with larger organizations that have typical structures. They have an innovation department, they have a marketing department, right?
Do those ever work, the quote unquote innovation departments?
Yeah,
Do they?
R&D, innovation. And again, it's all about aligning them to the principles, right? And they have to be open to, working as a team, putting down those biases, those historical and people biases, and then also embracing collaboration. But here's what makes Quester different: a collaboration with the consumer at the center. Now, I know that consumer centric is a buzzword, right? When I talk to our clients and I'm even when we're interviewing potential clients, one of the big things that we say is we don't say consumer centricity. We do say empathy at the center, right? Human or consumer empathy. And we even put the word radical empathy. And the example I usually give is if you're sitting in a room and you're talking about the consumer, and let's say you're looking at data, whether it's from your insights, research, or analytics team, sales team, you name it, right? When you're looking at that data, does the majority of the room and the people in the room look at that data and seek to understand, or do they seek to question and discredit?
Mm.
Right? Humans, people are irrational human beings. We rationalize a lot of what we do, but it forms a narrative. If you are not empathetic of that narrative, then you're not consumer centric. And if you and you can't just use the buzzword, you have to live it, you have to breathe it. And so that is the thing I believe that separates companies who do innovation very, very well within large organizations and companies who do not. Is do they actually have empathy for the everyday consumer, and do they realize that 99% of the time no one in that room is actually representative of the actual consumer who's buying their products online or at Walmart or at Target, you name it. Right?
Yeah.
So that's a real big piece, and then that becomes the foundation. If they have that, or if they're open to it, that's when we apply a very specific framework, jobs to be done, demand spaces, person-based segmentation, right? Where we're double clicking and getting at needs, emotions, jobs, perfect fulfillment specs, social, emotional, functional elements from the words of a consumer, right? At a very, very large scale. We have some proprietary methods to do all of that. I don't need to get into all that boring stuff, but it is what separates us from a lot of other companies, is that becomes our foundation. Combine that with radical consumer or human empathy, all of a sudden white spaces start to emerge because you're open, you're receptive, and you're seeking to understand.
How do you measure empathy? Right. I think if you were to ask 10 people, are you empathetic? I imagine 10 people are going to say yes, but from an outside perspective, you might be like, well, you're less empathetic than you need to be. Like, how do you measure, how do you help someone hold up a mirror to say you are empathetic enough to be successful in this endeavor?
I usually give them those examples where I put up something, maybe that something, a fact statement or a piece of data. I put it up to them and it may be wrong. And I even ask them historically, what have they done? And so it's really a gut feeling of when you first see that piece of data, if it doesn't make sense to you, do you seek to understand in your gut, or do you seek to question, discredit?
Mm.
And I think that fundamentally people can answer that questions, maybe not of themselves, but of their colleagues. Because we all know that there are those people in the room who see those things, those moments, and say, I don't believe that. That can't be right. Where did we get this data? Right? How many people did we talk to? Right? You see all of those questions to try to actually discredit what's being shown versus seeking to understand. And again, that seeking to understand is also recognizing that we are irrational people.
So it almost sounds like a subtext there is that you have to approach it with the expectation that you have data integrity. And I know like a lot of organizations that I've seen, they don't have the best data integrity. So how do you square those two things between having a healthy skepticism that, did someone copy over the history correctly enough 2 years ago and we're looking at the right thing, versus really going down a path and saying, well, if it says that people like to buy butter for $25, then like let's understand that.
Yeah. And that's where it's okay, if you have a historical experience where the data integrity isn't there, are you open to other forms of data that has integrity? And are you willing to ask us the questions and have the dialogue of why our data might have more integrity than the historical data that you're talking about? But again, a lot of people are also closed off to it. I've met a lot of organizations that have built very, very successful innovation pipelines, launched great products, not talking to their consumers, right? But it's coming harder and harder to find those instances. But go ahead.
Well, I imagine that when you were referring to other sources of data that have integrity, talking to someone, and unless you're expecting them to just lie to your face, I imagine that's got to be a pretty high credibility data source, I imagine.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So it sounds like being open and talking to people who are already buying your product is 9/10 of the way there. Is that an accurate way to think about it?
Yeah, I think it's a matter of having a deep understanding of what drives human behavior, whether that is rational or irrational, whether it's true or false. Right? I have this saying that my team probably gets tired of hearing it, and some of my clients probably get tired of hearing it. The stories that we tell ourselves as human beings, and the stories that we tell others, and the stories that we allow to come into our lives, all form narratives. Those narratives, some people call them values, some people call them a number of different things. We call them narratives. Those narratives shape your human behavior. And if we look at right now, in the current economy, I'm not going to put an adjective on the end of it. I'm just going to say economy. If you're listening to stories about an impending recession, if you're talking about an impending recession, right, and you're telling yourselves about an impending recession, that is your narrative. And your narrative is going to drive very different behaviors every single day versus somebody who says, no, this is a shock to the market, but we're going to get through it, right? It's short-term pain for long-term gain. they're listening to very different stories and they're allowing them into their lives. They're telling those stories and they're telling themselves. That forms their narrative, and it will shape very different behaviors for them as well. And so when we start to think about innovation, you have to understand those narratives to understand what you're truly solving for and the progress you're trying to help people make in their lives. And it even goes to marketing them, right? How many great innovations have failed because we just didn't market them the right way?
Yeah. Is it more important to tell yourself a narrative and innovate toward that narrative, or to try to understand the narratives that consumers are telling themselves?
So if you're a startup, right, this is where I draw a fundamental difference between startups versus large organizations. When you're a startup, I truly believe that most founders have a pretty deep understanding of the consumer, their potential consumer narrative, and their own narrative, right? Now, there might be some friction and some collision in there, right? Because I've also seen startups where they believe that their narrative and their solution is actually better to solve for the consumer than the consumer's thinking themselves. Sometimes that's true, sometimes that's not. When you're a large organization, I 100% believe that you need to understand that consumer narrative.
Mm.
Because innovation becomes more risky the larger you get. It
Sure.
costs more.
Bigger dollars, more volume, more
It
public. Yeah. Makes
costs more
sense.
money, right? If
It
I'm
makes
in
sense.
if I'm in my garage baking something or making something and it doesn't sell because I'm selling it to my neighbors, okay, I may have lost a little bit of money, but I can reformulate and I can go out again. Right? Similar to marketing and packaging of products. When you're in that early stage, if your marketing doesn't land right away, you can be agile, you can shift. When you're a large organization, you don't have that luxury.
Yeah.
Right?
Every bet is more substantial and more public. So that makes a ton of sense. At what point do you think a startup becomes a big company from that point of view? Is it when the founder takes more of a management role, or because there's a point there where what you're talking about, this connection to the consumer, this idea around the narrative that they're telling themselves, the narrative that the consumer's telling, there's a point where those are going to diverge. And I'm wondering if you've seen this, where is it a particular dollar revenue? Is it a particular
Yeah.
title change? Like, where does that change?
I think it is, if you look at a startup, you have, let's say, first generation of whatever product or service that it is. When first generation might not even work, right? And you're on to second generation, you're on to third, right? To me, it's once you've been successful, right? And you have a healthy amount of users, consumers, etc., on whatever generation that you're on. So let's say first generation, you landed 50 consumers. Second generation was better. You're up to, 2,500, 3,000. Third generation, you're at 100,000. Fantastic, right? You, in your mind, for that industry, you've hit that velocity. When you go from third to fourth generation, or whatever generation you're on, once you feel comfortable, that's when I think that you need to start bringing in robust innovation processes. Why? It's usually at that point where, if you're a startup, you have more funding, so you have more people, you have more fragmentation, you have more opinions. The founder can't do everything anymore, right? Hopefully you have instilled something like the principles of the founder's mentality, but if you haven't, innovation starts to fail at those areas because you're becoming too big. You're becoming too fragmented. Even though you say you're not fragmented, inevitably you are. When you start to have various different levels of management, when you have ideas that are being filtered from somebody who you could just go stand by their desk and get an idea, versus now that idea goes up to maybe one level of management, maybe two levels of management, and it's filtered all the way through.
Yeah. It's interesting because I don't know if this is the intention, but it's almost as if you're saying when you're a young startup, you don't need to have a well-polished innovation process,
No.
right? Because so much of it's just going to be iterating and riffing and going through that. Um, and so it kind of sounds like once you start to hit a certain scale, that's when you need to start
Yep.
institutionalizing things.
Yeah. Now, in the early days when you're a startup, your innovation process, there should be some process, but it should be agile and it should be loose to allow you flexibility. But there should be some guardrails. I worked at a startup, and you know there were times where it felt like because there were no guardrails, it was just always chasing what the next big deal would be. If you talk to, let's say, a healthcare system and they said, "Oh my God, I love this. We would be willing to sign the dotted line if you built this feature," all of a sudden that feature becomes your next priority.
Yeah,
Is
absolutely.
that's not an and if that is the case, that becomes your innovation process, and you have to acknowledge it, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and then you staff accordingly. You're going to have probably a lot of excess capacity so that you can be reactive as things come through. So that makes a ton of sense. I'd love to shift gears a little bit. I mean, a lot of folks that listen to the podcast are not only looking to improve their businesses today, which you've helped a lot with, but really want to look at building something that they eventually want to exit. And so
Yeah.
I'm curious to know from your point of view, if you were an acquirer, right, what makes an innovation process valuable versus just a collection of ideas?
I really think it depends upon who's acquiring you. Is it private equity? Is it a strategic buyer? Is it a competitor? Right? Each one of those is going to have a varying degree of how much they care about the process. If it's a strategic buyer, right, and it's taking them into a completely different category. So I'm in this category. I'm going to buy a company that takes me to a completely different category. I know nothing about that category. All of a sudden, their process and their ideas are really, really important to me. Whereas if I'm buying somebody and I'm a competitor, I'm eventually going to make them adopt to my innovation process. So what I really care about is their number of ideas. So I do believe that it's really dependent upon who is acquiring you. But at the end of the day, if I had to put more weight on one versus the other, Aaron, it would be the ideas. And I'm not talking about having hundreds or thousands of ideas. I'm talking about having a kind of a systematic way in which you're not just collecting ideas, but you're charting those ideas. Right?
It
It
kind of comes
has to
back
be.
to assessing if they're empathetic, if they're able to listen, all those sorts of things. So what you're almost saying is that it is more important to have fewer high quality ideas than just a slew of random ideas that someone's got to sift through.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I want to know if I'm acquiring a business, which I was lucky enough to do last year. I know what they did today. I wanted to know where else could we take it? What ideas did they have? And what I appreciated about it was I didn't get 100 ideas. I got 2 or 3 really, really well thought out ideas. So as someone who's getting ready to sell their business, my challenge to them is to break it up into not just short, medium, and long-term ideas, but break them up into, viability, feasibility, level of investment that it would take at and then within short, you have very different pockets, subgroups. Medium, same thing. Long term, same thing. That's more important for a potential partner who's going to acquire you. If they're seeing that you've done that level of due diligence, and it doesn't have to be exhaustive, but it has to be some level of thought process to it, I think that increases your valuation because it gives them a better picture of what the future could be versus just the present.
Yeah, it's interesting because so much of that is going to be dependent on the people who are involved in that and building the innovation process. And if a founder is looking to sell and step away, that can be almost a risk to the business. And so, how does an acquirer assess if the innovation pipeline is going to be sustainable beyond those original founders?
I think it's art and science. I really do. I mean, at some level, if you're the acquirer, you have to believe in your people, and you have to recognize there might be some attrition. If there is attrition, do you have the confidence in your people or your ability to replace those people? Right? That's kind of the art to it. The science is more of how successful are you at launching innovations? Right? Do you have a good track record? Do you have a system in place? You have to assume that there's going to be some attrition. And oftentimes in those businesses, if you're depending upon the size of them, you ask yourself, who is driving the innovation at those organizations and what's at risk if they leave? I don't know if I really answered your question.
But it was a good answer regardless. I think that, it is, what I heard from that was that you really have to take a look at the people, process, and those are probably the two biggest things there. And if there is an innovation process that is based on a really charismatic or visionary founder, right? Like I think Apple and Steve Jobs comes to mind. There was you got Tony Ives, you got Steve Jobs. They were just creating all of these sorts of things that were out there. And one of the big criticisms after Tim Cook took over was, are you going to be able to do anything, right? And to some extent, maybe they have, maybe they haven't, at least not in the same sort of trajectory. But it's a much bigger company than was today. And so perhaps the rubric for that kind of innovation has changed where, I don't know, if Apple can't make $50 billion on something, it's probably not worth their time. Whereas anybody else would be like, hey, I'll take $1 billion.
Yeah. I mean, it changes with the growth of the organization. There's no doubt about it. You look at, I look at the food and beverage industry. So obviously big acquisition that recently occurred with Poppy.
Mm-hmm.
Now, could a brand, one of the big brands, could they have done that? Yeah. By themselves? Absolutely. But there is a world where there are so many innovators right now, and the barrier to entry, this is the key change, Aaron. The barrier to entry in food and beverage used to be really high because you had to go through the retailers, right? In order to get any sort of scale, you had to get through the retailers. Now that the world is shifted to a direct-to-consumer model and consumers are more open to it, the consumer packaged goods, food and beverage industry, all of a sudden, you can have really great ideas and you can launch them into the market and you don't have to have the retailer on your side. So now if I'm thinking I'm a big business, right? Big global food and beverage company, do I make it on my own? Do I innovate on my own? Or do I just watch the territories? Do I do the analysis to identify the territories that I want to go in and then start quietly watching and doing competitive intelligence on those brands that exist and are more D2C? What's the risk reward?
Mm-hmm.
Right? One of those brands starts to emerge as a household name, buy it. And we've seen several success stories around that, right? It doesn't have to get to a, Poppy level, but it can be much smaller. But you have to understand the territories and the consumer need first and foremost.
Poppy's a really interesting example because, Pepsi acquired them, but Coke, just before the acquisition, launched their own probiotic soda. And so, if you had to hypothesize kind of where that came from, I mean, probiotic soda was not something that was new at the time, right? Coke was going through this. Do you have any hypothesis in terms of why they might have that build versus buy decision, or did Coke just have this idea before Poppy and it took them 10 years to execute on it?
My hypothesis is one of them started the development and was maybe one started and another one didn't, or they both started and one was just more successful. But at the end of the day, I think that they watched the market grow.
Mm-hmm.
Coke had the mentality of, we can build it. Pepsi, who has done a lot more acquisitions, especially on the snacking side of their business, said, well, let's just buy it. Okay? And I think that what it really boils down to, Aaron, is what is whoever is in charge, what is really the philosophy around market growth, and is it, do I buy my way into market growth, or do I build my way into market growth?
Yeah, would you say that acquisition is a form of innovation, or is it just buying innovation that someone else did?
I think it can be both. I think that in that case, it was a buying innovation, right? Other times, yeah, I could give examples of both, but for that one specifically, I think you were buying an innovation. Sometimes you're buying a technology that will ultimately lead to an innovation, if that makes sense, right? Maybe there's a smaller organization startup that has a formulation that, they don't see it.
Unilever in K18, perfect example, right? They had this unique protein that they created to help with hair. Unilever bought that, and now they're able to use that compound in literally every other shampoo that they have. So
There you go.
yeah, that makes a lot of sense there.
Yeah. But it's understanding, you talk about these companies, and these are, these large institutions. They do believe in human empathy. They do have a deep understanding in consumer. I've met many, many people who've worked there. And so I think that's what makes them successful at whether they build it or whether they buy it. Not everything, but that's why they've maintained where they have. Um, yeah, it's really interesting.
No, that's fascinating. I want to go back to this culture clash that we're talking about between startups and large companies. One of the things I've seen that has played out that's really plagued acquisitions is just the approach to innovation, because it may be very different from the startup than it is from the big company. And so you've talked about the need for empathy and kind of trying to control for that. So many times I see big companies either not want to get involved in the startup because they don't want to squash that creative
Yep.
spirit that was there, or they get overly involved and they kind of take these big processes and put them onto there, and there's just chafing and a lot of turnover because of that. How do you solve that, right? Like, how do you assess if you've got the right mentality, the right culture for both the acquirer and the acquired? And then how do you go about building something that is going to be successful for both of those organizations given where they are?
Yeah, I think it needs to happen in the due diligence phase.
What would you look for in the due diligence phase then?
I would hire an innovation consultant, an outside one, right? The innovation consultant is not sitting there trying to come up with a valuation or anything like that. What they're trying to do, and somebody like yourself could go in and you interview the startup and the key players and understand how innovation is done, right? You give them various different hypothetical situations, like the ones you were just talking about. Well, what happens if you come into an organization and this happens? How do you respond? They're not going to be able to give you the most accurate answer, but what you're looking for is that emotional response. Like, oh, do they, put their heads back and do things like that? Then also talk to the acquiring company to understand how innovation is done there. What are the challenges and pain points? Not from the people just at the top, but middle management. And because the middle is what's going to actually start to work with the startup. Right? And by having those kinds of conversations, I think that you can determine in the due diligence phase and have a much more honest conversation post-acquisition of, hey, the innovation consultant told us this. We think it's best that we leave you alone because of what they've told us. But yet we know that you need the resources. So how do we build a process that stays out of your way early, but gives you the resources at a certain point in time? Maybe that's one example. Or it's, hey, our innovation consultant said, the best of both worlds is if we combine you into our innovation process. Here's what we think it would look like. Tell us, let's have an honest conversation about it. I don't think that that's being done enough.
I completely agree. And it's so interesting to me that you will bring in a consulting company, a typical, big five consulting company, to come look at the financial metrics,
Yep.
right? And just does this deal pencil out? And so much of it is, can I make the math work in a spreadsheet? And the harm in that is that there are people involved. And as you're going through this due diligence process, yeah, a lot of acquirers are assessing to say, okay, how much of this team do we want to keep? How much do we need to replace? Are there different roles? Do we want to bring them into our organization? But I think what you're talking about is really a deeper layer than that. And it's understanding what is that inherent bias or essence of
Yeah.
both the acquirer and the acquired, and understanding, does it fit? We've done quite a bit of work with like IBP processes and SNOP and things like that. And we've developed 5 different archetypes that
Yep.
we try to go through and plot different companies in, because, a command and control type company where everything is geared around pushing information to a founder and then executing that founder's vision is going to behave very, very differently than a bottoms up organization where the franchisees or different countries have so much less. And so I think understanding that yes, the math needs to pencil out, that's a prerequisite, but understanding that there is these companies are different and not every acquisition is going to be the exact same is so important.
Yeah. And culture clashes, in my opinion, culture clashes are what kills a successful post-acquisition, post-merger, and not doing enough like thought process to what does that new culture need to look like, because it's going to have a little bit of both. It might be predominantly the acquirer, but it's going to have a little bit of the previous, and you kind of want it to a little bit, otherwise they'll leave.
Yeah, absolutely. Man, this is fascinating. I think I've had so much things I've thought about and hadn't thought about before. Just this idea of, it's not about a formula or, here's the 5-step stage gate process for how to innovate. It really is, are you in the right team space, the mental space to accept that there could be different versions of the truth than your inherent bias that you've walked in on? And I think that's kind of the key thing that I've taken away with. Is there anything else there that you would tell to a startup who's trying to get ready to be acquired, or an acquirer that just bought a startup, in terms of how do you make sure that culture is one that is ripe for innovation? And if it's not, how do you fix it?
Yeah. It was funny. Yesterday, I was having a conversation with a large team, and we're helping build their brand architecture and their future innovation pipeline. And we were sharing some early results. And in preparation for kind of our next meeting, I said, hey, I want everybody to think about, like, are there specific territories that you're going to tell us, like, if we come to you, you're going to be like, no, we will not do that. Right? I'd rather have them now before our next meeting. Or, are there things that you're really excited about? And I said, don't everybody go out all at once. And there was a long silence. And the GM finally chimed in and said, you know what? We're actually open to everything. And we need to be open to everything. Yeah, there are some historical things that maybe we're not as excited about, but maybe we executed them wrong. And so that was a really, amazing conversation, because that opens the world for us in terms of opportunities. But we asked that question. You have to ask that question, because there are other meetings I'll have where, C-level will say, yeah, we're absolutely not going into that space. Even though everybody else is clamoring for it and they think it's a great idea, we're not doing it.
Mm. Yeah, and I guess, like, is that just those biases that you talked about that kind of prevents them from doing that, or is it? It sounds like one of those companies is going to be much more successful than the other.
I don't know. I think that in this case, I actually think both are going to be successful. I would say that the one who said we can't go into that territory understands their operational constraints.
Okay.
Right. And I appreciate that. Right. If they can tell me why they won't do it, and it's maybe operational, it's maybe, margin, you name it, right? Whatever that reason is, it just isn't a fundamental good business decision. Then the crazy side of my brain says, how do we make it one? But at least you put that in terms of a more longer term potential.
Awesome. Well, Tim, I know we're coming up on time, and this has been so great. I think we could talk for
Oh, yeah.
a very long time again. We've got two questions that we always ask our guests on Build a Business Worth Buying. And the first one is, what is the best example of a moat that you've seen a business build?
I think the one that comes to mind initially, right, gut level, is Spotify. Right? They were a disruptor, clearly a disruptor, but their ability to create playlists, share playlists, follow playlists, I think that drives a system lock-in that almost creates this fear of missing out.
Mm.
Right? It used to be, in my opinion, music used to be about accessing the music right when it hit, right when it launched. Well, everyone can do that now. But I think that music, it's now become this adventure of finding new music. And I think the younger generation has started this. It's not the most popular person that's being played on the radio, but everyone can be a musician now because of YouTube and all of these other streaming, TikTok, you name it. And so it's the ability to that fear of missing out, that I might not find somebody because I'm not following the right people who are really good at recommending and finding other talent. That's mine. And who knows if Spotify believes that or not. I just, that's what I think.
I mean, there's basically two streaming services in the world, and it's Apple and Spotify. And so, I use Spotify all the time, so that's a good one. Last question. If you had to start over and you were going to start today, how would you go about building a business worth buying?
If I was going to start today building a business worth buying, and it was in the services sector where I'm at, right? Where I'm selling more to the B2B, B2B services, brand and innovation. What I would do is some probably pretty deep and immersive research on various different brands, whether they be sizes, etc., around their innovation processes. Right? So everything that we've been talking about, from startup to big business, from looking at various different innovation processes and building metrics in terms of like what is a successful innovation, what's not. The business that I would build is essentially custom innovation pipelines, development for these various different audiences. I think that where generative AI is going, you have a little bit more opportunity to do that. You don't have to be so people heavy to start an organization. And I also think that understanding what takes a company from here to here, from an innovation perspective, there is a lot of rich case studies that I think that if you were to analyze them the right way, you might be able to find various different processes to where you can go into an organization and say, hey, based on everything that you're telling me, you need this process versus this one versus this one. That's maybe what I do.
Yeah,
so hell of a lot of research.
Spoken like a true researcher, so that makes a lot of sense. Well, Tim, this has been great. I really appreciate you coming on. If people want to connect with you or learn more about Quester, what's the right way to do that?
Yeah, LinkedIn is probably the best. So Tim Hoskins, president of Quester. You can find Quester on LinkedIn or my profile. Shoot me a message. Always love to talk about this stuff. It's exciting. It's fun. The world's changing fast. But you can also reach out to us on our website, www.quester.com.
Awesome. All right. Thank you, everybody, and tune in next week.
Thanks, Aaron.
Thanks for joining me on Build a Business Worth Buying, brought to you by ISBA Consulting. I hope today's conversation gave you real insights into scaling smarter, selling better, and thinking like a strategic operator. If you found value in this episode, make sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who's building their own sellable business. Until next time, remember, the real win isn't just building a business, it's building one worth buying.